Minhas senhoras, meus senhores, é um grande prazer e uma honra estar aqui convosco nesta conferência, que vai ser uma conferência particularmente interessante. Eu represento aqui o Presidente da Sociedade de Geografia, sou o mero Vice-Presidente, mas represento o professor Aires de Barros, que não pode estar presente, e aproveito para dizer que é com grande prazer que a Sociedade de Geografia acolhe esta conferência. A Sociedade de Geografia é uma sociedade que já tem 150 anos, que foi criado no tempo do rei Dom Luís, que sempre teve como objetivo dedicar-se à investigação. Nós temos várias comissões, comissão da América, comissão da África, comissão realmente para a Ásia, comissão para os oceanos, e temos realmente um museu que diz muito a respeito da história de Portugal e que também muito nos honra. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us, and I'm going to give the floor afterwards to Dr. António Pinto Marques, who is the president of Grêmio Literário, and he's also a very good friend of mine. Well, it's more important to be president of Grêmio Literário than to be, well, my friend, of course, but I must also tell it. And then Dr. José Sarmento, who is also a good friend, and is going to make a wonderful presentation about the two conferences. And then afterwards we'll have a reasonable period where questions are going to be asked, and you'll answer to those questions. And I'm now, if you allow me, going to say some few words in French, because we have also French here. So, je vais dire quelques paroles en français, parce que nous avons ici un invité spécial qui est français, et les Français aiment être bien soignés. Je le sais, ça fait partie de l'histoire française. Et j'aimerais bien dire que c'est un grand plaisir d'avoir deux conférencistes qui sont spécialisés en économie internationale. Et merci bien. Je vais donner maintenant la parole à Monsieur le Président de Grêmio Literário. I'm going to give the floor to the President of Grêmio Literário, António Pinto Marques.
Muito boa tarde. Os meus cumprimentos, amigos, ao professor Dr. António Rebelo de Sousa, e peço-lhe que transmita também os meus cumprimentos ao professor Aires de Barros, presidente da Sociedade de Geografia, em nome pessoal e em nome pessoal e em nome das instituições organizadoras, o Círculo Essa de Queiroz, o Centro Nacional de Cultura e o Grêmio Literário. Agradeço à Sociedade de Geografia o amável acolhimento. Cumprimento os oradores Bill Helmut e Filipe Ries. O moderador do debate, José Sarmento. Os organizadores, Pedro Rebelo de Sousa, Guilherme de Oliveira Martins. Cumprimento todos os presentes nesta conferência. A Sociedade de Geografia acolhe a 4ª conferência do ciclo Novas Conferências do Casino 2023, ciclo promovido pelo Círculo Essa de Queiroz, pelo Centro Nacional de Cultura e pelo Grêmio Literário. Sobre o tema o fim da globalização, uma fusão impossível. Participam nesta conferência os jornalistas internacionais Bill Helmut e Filipe Ries. Vivemos tempos de participação na Europa, de pacificação, após a Segunda Guerra Mundial e após a Guerra Fria e queda do regime soviético, com crescente entrada destes países na União Europeia. Assistimos neste tempo ao desenvolvimento da economia mundial com parceiros impensáveis em anos anteriores, numa abertura de mercados sem precedentes na história económica. A globalização deu seus passos com grande abertura à China, que substituiu a indústria em decadência na Europa. Contudo, a China revelou ser uma grande potência em ascensão, desequilibrando os sistemas de forças políticas, afetando o poder dos Estados Unidos, principal potência económica mundial e tradicional parceiro da Europa. A crise da guerra na Ucrânia, com a invasão pela Rússia, acrescentou um novo grave problema ao Ocidente europeu, pondo em causa o modelo existente de abertura das fronteiras, a dependência energética e o modelo de comércio internacional de produtos. Como solucionar este conflito político e económico, com a crescente poder de forças extremistas na Europa, é o desafio que os defensores da democracia e da liberdade têm que enfrentar com propostas alternativas, mas execuíveis para o bem dos povos. Pensar o presente é tentar solucionar questões fundamentais com vista ao futuro. Tradição e projeto das Conferências do Caseiro. Muito obrigado.
Bem, agora passava a palavra ao Dr. José Sarmento.
Boa tarde a todos. Muito obrigado por terem vindo a esta nossa quarta conferência com um tema muito atual e que nós esperamos que nos acrescente algumas ideias para compreendermos melhor o momento em que estamos. E começaria, speaking of a globalized world, what a better place could we choose to discuss world trade and economy than this Sociedade, Geografia, that belongs to a country that before no other contributed to the end of the human ignorance in the geography of the world. Indeed, we, the Portuguese, started the very first world globalization. And with us came the Spanish, then it was the turn of the Dutch, the British, the French, and lastly the Germans. By the end of the 19th century, the time that this Sociedade was created, in an open and globalized world, the geography and the economy were controlled by the European empires, all of them with their own sort of Sociedade, Geografia. It happens in London, it happens in Paris, it happens everywhere. But this is our Sociedade, Geografia, our presence in the world. Of course, all of this is history. Our current period of globalization, the one that we are talking today, started less than 40 years ago with the relocation, as was already mentioned, by the Western industry to China, the new world factory. Until very recently, the old industrialized nations seemed happy with the idea of becoming mere consumers of cheap products. It was a rather nice transformation because China, then ruled by Deng Xiaoping, was only interested feeding its vast poor population and taking the country out of decades of ideological self-destruction that Mao's regime had established. The problem for the globalized world arrived when, already flooded by Chinese products, we discovered a new generation of Chinese leaders who mixed their industrial and commercial power on the global scale with their new mission to rule the world. The limits of the globalization are not only expressed by the standoff with China, namely with the United States and China. China is the new contender for the global supremacy. because even between friends, between country friends that have no intentions of world dominance, we came to discover that borders are still a dominant rule. This was the case with the arrest in Japan of Carlos Ghosn, which resulted in the de facto breakup of the alliance Renault-Nissan. Even between two allied countries, France and Japan, known to be part of the same West, the same world, the national reflex spoke louder than economic rationality. Philippe Reyes' book, Broken Alliance, dismantled the thesis that the problem lied in the financial illegalities of an outstanding manager. Contrary to what was said in the world media, something quite different was at stake. The prospect of the merger, that meant the disappearance of a Japanese company within a French company, was unbearable for the Japanese nationalist pride. The Japanese bureaucracy moved to secure the defense of the homeland and along the way sacrificed one of the greatest industrial success of our time. After all, borders do exist, as we see now between Poland and Ukraine. It's extraordinary. How can they now start a commercial war, a political war, when they are confronted with such a huge situation? So now, what is left of globalization? To address these matters, we are lucky enough to have with us two very special speakers, Bill Emmott and Philippe Reyes. Bill Emmott is a journalist and author who was, as already mentioned, chief editor of The Economist between 1993 and 2006. Currently, he is no longer at The Economist. He is the chairman of several very prestigious institutions like the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the Trinity College of Dublin, the Japanese Society of the UK, and the International Trade Institute. Mr. Emmott is the author of 14 books that deal on Japan, Asia, Italy, and the 20th century. In 2007, he published The Fate of the West, the battle to save the world's most successful idea, and we understand that in January there will be a new book that Bill is finishing. Philippe Reyes, there, is a journalist and an author that here will present his book, Broken Alliance. Philippe devoted his life to the Agence France-Presse, an old and powerful machine that even today, with the galactic of Facebook, Twitter, and the like, fights and sometimes wins in the media world. A man of information all over the globe, Philippe was responsible in the Agence France-Presse in Tokyo and Brussels. I strongly recommend this book on what's happened in Japan with Carlos Ghosn to those who believe in the sacred forces of globalization. So let's hear our speakers. Thank you.
My task today is to talk about globalization. The title of the conference, The End of Globalization. Is it really ending? Should it really end? Those are the questions that I'm going to address. But let me start by saying that it's a strange word, globalization, in any language, because no one here will have been the minister for globalization. There's never a policy of globalization. Globalization is an outcome, it's a consequence of other policies, of other choices that we make. Vasco da Gama certainly never spoke about globalization. His voyages were consequences. Now, despite the fact that it's just a description of an outcome, globalization has become a word of hate, a word that ranks alongside neoliberalism, globalist. These are terrible insults because of the anger in societies about inequality, about the disruption that's come from new competition, anger essentially about change, not related to personal improvement. But I will argue that the main reason that globalization and globalism has become associated with this anger is not anything to do with economics. It's not anything to do with business. It has everything to do with politics. The reason it's become used as such a hate word is the simple reason in every society, in every democracy, foreigners don't vote. Foreigners can be blamed for anything that is going wrong without cost in the political system. And that is, in my view, why globalization has become blamed for a lot of other things that are happening. Most of the issues of inequality, almost all of the issues to do with deindustrialization are the consequences of technology, not of globalization, I will argue. And I will explain my point of view straight away. It is the point of view of Joni Mitchell. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've lost until it's gone? If globalization came to an end, we would all regret it. So here I am symbolizing globalization, an Englishman talking in Portugal and quoting a Canadian about globalization. And it's true. I am a globalist. I am a symbol of globalization. In fact, until people hear my accent, very often they can't work out where I'm from. In my career, I've been told that I must be a Mexican, maybe because of my beard. I've been told I've come out of a Dutch portrait from the Dutch period of globalization. I've even once been told that I probably am Japanese. Will my Japanese friends agree with that? I don't think so, but nevertheless. But most important, I want to tell you, disclose to you, that Silvio Berlusconi, the former Prime Minister of Italy, in 2001, when he was running for office, he knew exactly who I was, because we at The Economist had described him as unfit to rule Italy, and his newspaper published my photograph on the front page. He, Berlusconi, had called The Economist the e-communist, said it was a communist publication, and Il Giornale, his newspaper, pointed out that the editor looks like Lenin. So, you have in front of you a Lenin who is in favor of globalization. Perhaps this is imperialism, the final stage of capitalism. But I am an optimist as well as someone who, I believe, tries to learn from experience, from empirical evidence. My argument today will be that it is extraordinary that people are talking about the end of globalization so soon after we have seen the two greatest triumphs of globalization. The first great triumph of globalization was the globalization of science and technology that brought us COVID vaccines in record time with international collaboration between companies in Europe and America, with scientists collaborating all around the world and then distributing these vaccines. This was evidence of the power of globalization. The second great triumph of globalization has been even more recent. When Russia invaded Ukraine on February the 24th last year, we immediately knew we were in an energy crisis. We immediately criticized the fact that we were so dependent on Russian energy in Europe, that Russian gas and even Russian oil was such a critical lever, critical weapon against us in the European Union. 1.5 years later, we've almost completely eliminated that dependence. We have adjusted, not without cost, not without some pain, but in record time, 18 months, the European energy system has transformed itself away from that economic coercion, economic weapon against us. This could not have happened if it were not for globalization. the availability of alternative supplies, the availability of alternative partners, the availability of technologies to change our energy system surprisingly rapidly. And second, as we look today at the state of world politics, there is a mistake many of us make, which is that we see only two countries plus Russia. We see America and China, and then we see Russia creating this terrible war in Ukraine. The biggest phenomenon, I want to argue, in world affairs is actually not that anymore. It's the spread of economic power and economic influence and political influence to a whole lot of other countries, which in the media is now being called the Global South. It's misleading to call it the Global South, but let's hang on to that title. Geography has actually spread power. Globalization has spread power, and the voice of India, the voice of Indonesia, the voice of Malaysia, the voice of Saudi Arabia, the voice of Brazil, of course, the voice of many other countries is now far more powerful than it ever was before. And we see, as the tensions between the United States and Europe and China have increased, and tariff barriers were put up by President Trump against Chinese goods and maintained by President Biden, what has happened? The American trade deficit has actually risen, but actually the way it's risen is that trade has reallocated itself to other countries in the Global South, some of it, in fact, through Chinese investment, but also through other countries stepping in. Supply chains have adjusted. If you think of globalization, the world economy as being like a river, if you put up a barrier, the river changes course and goes in another direction. And that is very much what is happening and what has happened. For globalization, ladies and gentlemen, is not really a question of economics. It's not a question of business. Businesses and economies respond to two other forces, politics and technology. And really, the fate of globalization is in the hands of those two things, politics and technology. And as long as politics and technology either allow or even enable the flow of the water of business and the economy to move in new places, globalization will survive. But I will tell you, so I will argue that we are not seeing the end of globalization, we are seeing a new phase of globalization. But I will tell you, however, how, if globalization ever ends, how this will happen and what we will understand as to what is the end of globalization. The history that José very ably summarized is a history of globalization in which it has been always politics and technology that have determined how things have happened. That was true in the age of discoveries and the age of empire. It was shipping technology, maritime technology plus cannons that really enabled that form of globalization. Then, in the 19th century globalization, the first fully broad, almost very widely shared globalization among the European powers, it was the combination of peace in Europe after 1815, most of the time peace, combined with the Industrial Revolution, which brought steam power, ships able to sail much more capably around the world, and above all, communications. The electric telegraph in the middle of the 19th century, this combination of technologies enabled the first great wave of globalization from 1815, 1820 until 1914 to happen. Politics and technology changed, and business and the economy followed. So then we saw the first end of globalization, again, as explained by José. What caused the first end of globalization? Well, it's simple. It was the First World War, which led to the collapse of empires, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, It led to the Bolshevik Revolution. We got the Treaty of Versailles, which was a very nationalist and very hostile treaty. And then we produced the Depression and the collapse from 1929 onwards, financial and otherwise. And out in Asia, in the Pacific, Japan, trying to become an imperial power, copying the Europeans, then found itself in a fight for resources. So it was politics that brought globalization to an end and that produced a Second World War in 1939 to 1945, depending on how you date it, which countries you're in. The interwar period was when globalization really came to an end, with huge tariffs, huge barriers, and huge mutual hostility. So I would date, and I will disagree a little with my friend José, I would date the third and greatest period of globalization, not just 40 years ago, but 75 years ago, from 1950. Really, it was the end of the Second World War, which produced a huge growth in trade and foreign investment that we have enjoyed ever since, with two causes: peace and the political consequences of peace after 1945, obviously overlaid with American hegemony, and secondly, technology. Again, the costs of communications dropped dramatically in the 1950s and 1960s, thanks to telephones, thanks to the rise of the transistor, thanks especially to a dramatic fall in the costs of shipping. This then was built into what we now think of as globalization through the changing domestic politics of Europe, of the United States and Canada and Japan. The first great beneficiaries of globalization outside Europe and America were Japan and then the Asian tigers, as we came to call them, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. The opening through peace of markets made Japan, during the time when Philippe Ries and I first encountered Japan as journalists in the 1980s, became Japan the great enemy in particularly North America, the industry that was going to sweep away American industry. The first great reversal of globalization happened under Ronald Reagan and his imposition of voluntary restraints on Japanese exports. Congressmen were breaking up Toshiba radios on the garden in front of Capitol Hill. This was a big backlash against the consequences of the first great period of globalization. The rest of the world had been held back from joining this globalization by the Cold War, by the division of the world into communism and capitalism, by also post-colonial period, as empires collapsed, of countries trying to achieve self-sufficiency. It was when that came to an end, when it was realized by China, under Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s, that the Japanese model of development was the right one to follow, that globalization really became turbocharged. China led the way, following the Japanese model, following the Korean model of an investment and foreign technology-led development that then had its consequence in exports. Latin America, after the debt crisis of the 1980s, also under the so-called Washington Consensus, liberalized its economies and really was the origin in the World Bank of the term emerging markets. Antoine von Achtmeyer was thinking about Latin American countries, first of all, as those emerging markets, but also China, and then the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and at the same time, India being influenced by the demise of the Soviet Union to also liberalize. So we get a turbocharged globalization, which just means a massive opening of economies around the world. It is true that from the 1990s onwards, globalization becomes somewhat focused on China. On China because China was the largest supply of labor, and Asian supply chains developed around China. China, as a huge economy, nonetheless behaved in the 1990s and 2000s as if it was an economy like Germany or the Netherlands. Trade, imports and exports became 60–70% of GDP because so many multinational companies were using China as the final assembly place for their goods. That was abnormal. What we're seeing today is that China is now becoming much more self-sufficient. Trade is collapsing as a share of GDP as the domestic economy has expanded. China is now converging on the United States. Trade is now 30% of GDP. In the United States, it's 25%. But China, nevertheless, is so big, the world's second largest economy, that, of course, it has dominated all thinking about globalization. And globalization continued strongly thanks to politics, because this was a period without conflict between the great powers. The Cold War was over. There were wars, of course, but they were not wars involving the big powers. So business and the economy could take its course as countries liberalized, and that, above all, meant China. China joined the World Trade Organization in 1999 on the basis of being a non-market economy. It was labeled from the start as a special economy, not a market economy, which gave other countries the power to use special measures to compete against it, but nevertheless, it joined, trade barriers on both sides fell, and trade expanded. So, where are we now? Having had this enormous globalization, became China-led, then I think where we are now has to start, first of all, with 2008, with the global financial crisis, and the end of what was a massive financial globalization, the enormous flows of credit fueled by Chinese savings that led to the crash of 2008 in America and Europe, that then produced the beginnings of a political backlash against what was going on in the economy. As we've gone from 2008 to 2023, competition between China and America for leadership in the world, as José said in his presentation and introduction, has intensified. And we do see business between the two economies becoming part of that competition, particularly the United States getting concerned about Chinese technological progress, and particularly the way that technology could become a competitive asset for China in military terms. So we do have an increase of barriers against the flow of technology into China. We have that implemented in an economic security law in Japan. We have the Netherlands and Korea and Japan agreeing with the United States to stop selling semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. We have all sorts of restrictions on technology trade with China. The second big thing that we see now is that countries have become very conscious of the risks of becoming dependent on one supplier for a particularly critical good. Russia, Ukraine was the big example of that, but the COVID pandemic also exposed some of those risks. So there is an attempt to try to reduce that dependency on one country. We are also at a time of increased concern and policy towards climate change. And if you are going to have an energy transition, then in economic terms, the whole problem is that the market is not recognizing the damage that is being done to the climate, and therefore government needs to intervene with taxes or subsidies or regulations, and that produces a new setback for globalization because it is a barrier to trade. And this has given a new prominence to industrial policy. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why there is a lot of talk about a retreat from globalization, and maybe even leading to an end. I think that my former colleagues at The Economist, if I may say, got it right when they said that there was not a retreat from globalization. It was what they call slowbalization. It's the slowing of globalization that's taken place thanks to this rise of the prominence of industrial policy and of subsidies. And where will it go? The important point, as I said in my opening remarks, was that this is not a world with just two economies, of the United States and China, or even the Western China. This is a world with many other countries that now have open economies and that have been growing substantially. And that means that the river of trade is able to divert. There was a very interesting paper delivered in August at the annual meeting of central bankers and economists in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, showing the way in which, after the Trump tariffs, actually trade had simply reallocated itself. Supply chains had changed. So our big question today is whether this great reallocation, the great reshaping, the great diversion of the river is going to lead to simply a new world, or whether it, with politics, could reimpose itself in such a way as to actually bring an end to globalization. I would point out, one, that dispersion of power in the world. Secondly, that technology is still an enormously powerful driver of globalization. Communications technology, artificial intelligence, life sciences, scientific and research collaboration are incredibly global and incredibly powerful. So, as in previous periods of globalization, technology is pushing forward. Our big question is whether politics might push backwards. And what I would say to you is that politics is pushing backward, but only in small ways. Politics also cannot push backwards very strongly with subsidies and with public spending because we all have big debts. We cannot afford to push back very hard with that. Ultimately, the question of politics and globalization is a military one. It's about war. National politics always pose big risks for business, and globalization has never ended this prominence of national politics in business decisions. But the ultimate risk, I would say, of an end to the great post-1945 globalization, which we are still enjoying, would in fact be a conflict between the United States and China. World War III would be a kind way to describe it. And that conflict, if it were to happen, would be started, of course, by the attempted invasion of Taiwan. Taiwan, named as Formosa in 1544 by the Portuguese, colonized by the Spanish, the Dutch, the Chinese. In fact, in practice, it's a Chinese colony from the 17th century to 1895, when then the Japanese took it over. Taiwan, Formosa as was, is a country isolated by geopolitics, but one that has always made its living through globalization. Globalization is strong. Globalization will continue to find new shapes, but if globalization ends, it will end in Formosa. It will end with Taiwan. And the most important mission that we have in our lifetimes is to try to avoid that war between the US and China, to avoid that war over Formosa. That is the subject of my next book, by the way. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for a very interesting conference. And now it's the time for our second special guest, Monsieur Philippe Reyes.
And if you allow me, I will start on a rather personal note. When I was a very young boy, not even a teenager, my favorite novel was The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. And some of you, I hope, may remember that this is a story of a young sailor that is a victim of an ugly conspiracy and end up for decades in a jail in the infamous Château d'If of the port of Marseille. The Château d'If is a sort of Alcatraz. It's an island, and it was a jail for a very, very long time. One very important figure in the Count of Monte Cristo is a Portuguese, the Abbot Faria. We say Faria in French, but I will try to use the proper pronunciation in Portuguese. And when I think of it today, Faria was my first encounter with Portugal, a country that was going to play such an important role in my life. And Faria, through the years he spent in the cell joined to the one of Edmond Dantès, Alexandre Dumas' hero, not only at the end provided Dantès with a rather surprising way to escape, but also with a way to become immensely rich, and as importantly, transmitted to Dantès all his immense knowledge and culture at the time. Why mentioning the Count of Monte Cristo? Because the Carlos Ghosn saga, at the heart of the Carlos Ghosn saga, there is also a conspiracy, and I will come back to that later. Strangely enough, except of course in this book, the conspiracy has been the forgotten dimension of the unraveling of the Renault-Nissan alliance and the fall of Carlos Ghosn. It has been obliterated by most of the media. And I suspect that part of the reason is the very successful, but also extremely expensive campaign of character assassination that has been launched by Nissan, by the Japanese authorities against Carlos Ghosn, and unfortunately joined by Renault and the French government as well. Now, you may remember also that for a long period of time, after he successfully turned around Nissan in the early 2000s, Carlos Ghosn became the embodiment of globalization. That's where we have the link with the period that we are covering. It's the Financial Times that once wrote, if I remember correctly, that if the Davos Forum, the World Economic Forum, this yearly gathering of the master of the world in the Swiss Alps, if the Davos would be a human being, it would be Carlos Ghosn. And there is several reasons for this. Of course, one is Carlos' personal history and family background. I remind you that he was born in Brazil, in a family with Lebanese roots, moved back to Lebanon very early on, was educated in elite French-speaking religious institutions in Beirut, then moved to Paris to become a student, graduated from two of the most prestigious French grandes écoles, Polytechnique and École des Mines de Paris. Apparently they say, no, it's Paris Mines. You know, this is a result of globalization. Most of the elite French schools are taking English names, but that's okay. And he then joined that most peculiar multinational Michelin. Why is it so peculiar? Because it's really hard to understand how you can become the largest tire maker in the world from Clermont-Ferrand. I mean, they would hate me, but Clermont-Ferrand is a bit of a cul de Judas. I mean, it's, as you say in Portuguese, it's not in the middle of nowhere, but certainly in the middle of France. And they managed to build, the Michelin family managed to build Michelin, the tire maker, as the world #1, now the world #2. And Carlos Ghosn got his experience, very crucial experience for him, of the US and the business, of making business in America, through completing a very complicated merger in the tire business in America, between the North American operation and of Michelin and what was before the Uniroyal Goodrich company. Another reason, another explanation beyond, and more important, probably beyond Carlos Ghosn's personal profile, is the timing. The timing of the alliance and the timing of globalization, of what we can discuss that later, what Bill called the turbocharged globalization. The alliance was concluded in March 1999. And Bill, sorry to correct you, and China joined the WTO at the Doha Ministerial Conference in 2001. But that was, of course, shortly after. And as you know, basically the rise of the alliance that became later on the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance, when Carlos also took care of the Mitsubishi Motor Corporation, part of that huge conglomerate, Japanese conglomerate. But from the onset, I must say that this alliance was a bit of a curiosity, because both companies and both countries, Renault and Nissan, France and Japan, were very unlikely partners for a lot of reasons. I will be short on this, but both France and Japan has been regarded most often accurately as a reluctant player of the global game. In France, you have this old anti-Americanism that still lingers, not only in the political and intellectual elites, but in a large part of the population. And globalization has always been regarded as something made in America. You have also, I must say, this heritage of archaeo-Marxist intellectual baggage, where the capitalism is regarded with suspicion, where becoming rich is basically hated. And to this day, I mean, the French people do not take any pride in the fact that the French companies are dominating the luxury good industry. And this is, by the way, provided tens of thousands of jobs to the country. No, they just hate it because Bernard Arnault, according to the stock market evolution, is either the most richest or second richest or third richest man in the world. But we can discuss globalization and inequalities later. And the two companies, because both Renault and Nissan, to these days, have been subject to a lot of political meddling. Renault was nationalized after the Second World War, and to today, the French government is still the largest shareholders and exerts a large influence on the company. And Nissan, as I made very clear in the book, is an unusual Japanese company. Unlike, let's say, Toyota, Honda, Mazda, Suzuki, that are private enterprising created by families, Nissan is a creation of the Japanese government in what was at the time the occupied Manchuria, the Manchukuo, when Japan invaded the northern part of China in the 30s. So, as a matter of fact, when the alliance was announced in 1999, it was greeted with almost universal skepticism. Well, there was a lot of good reason for this. One, of course, is that most merger in the car business has been huge failure. And actually, the Nissan-Renault alliance was announced shortly after the so-called merger of equals between Daimler and Chrysler that ended up extremely badly. But there was, and Carlos himself, I think when he was talking to students in Stanford, recalled that skepticism. And he said that people would say, no, you know, it takes more than 2 mules to produce a racehorse. And actually, he contradicted the skeptics because he took those 2 mules and made them in a racehorse, in a thoroughbred. Just to remind you, March 1999, Nissan, the second largest car maker in Japan, is weeks away from bankruptcy. The banks will not support its $20 billion debt anymore. The company produces 42 different models of cars. Out of the 42, 39 are losing money. The company has been losing money for 11 consecutive years. Basically, it's dead in the water. And Renault, at the same time, is regarded as too French, let's say too European, but certainly too French, too small, and not sufficiently profitable. So this was a very unlikely alliance and very unlikely to succeed. The Carlos Ghosn miracle, and you can talk about a miracle, is that he made it in a huge success. He made that in a huge success. Another issue I have with my colleagues in the media is that until today they still reduce the Carlos Ghosn business method to cost cutting, you know, laying off workers, clothing factories, and so on. If you look at the history of the alliance, it's exactly the opposite. Of course, when you are dealing with a patient that is in emergency, you need some drastic measures, or otherwise, most likely, the patient will die. So he started with cutting costs, laying off workers, and closing factories. But over a period of 15 years, the expansion of the alliance was absolutely dramatic. He opened new factories in the US, in Brazil. Most interestingly, he decided to create the new factory for Dacia, the low-cost brand of the Renault Group, so popular in Portugal, in Morocco. And other car makers followed, and Morocco now has a car industry that did not exist 10 years ago. And he was, of course, heavily criticized by the French political class to create a new factory in Morocco. Now, the same people are criticizing the fact that we have migrants assaulting our borders. But either way, you allow those countries to develop, you will have millions of people migrating to Europe. So you have to make your choice. He made the choice, and I think this was the right choice. I suppose Jose is looking at his watch, so I have to speed up. He also took Nissan into China, where it became the largest Japanese car maker, against a strong reluctance of the Japanese executive inside Nissan. He took Renault into Russia by taking over AvtoVAZ. Of course, today every clearly looking pundit will tell you that it was a huge mistake. Well, 10 years ago, it was not a mistake at all. It was a very rational and clever choice. It was opening Renault to a large car market with a third of that car market. So to make it brief, by 2017-18, the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance had become the largest car makers in the world by volume, not yet by profitability, overcoming both Toyota and Volkswagen. So what went wrong? Well, I would echo what Bill said. What went wrong was politics. And I would use the so-called butterfly effect. During the French presidential election campaign of 2012, the candidate that was going to be elected made a stupid commitment to steel workers in a small plant in northeast part of France. And 6 years later, with the arrest of Carlos Ghosn, the most successful business venture of the first decade of the 21st century in traditional industry, I'm not talking about high-tech, went crashing when Carlos was arrested at the Haneda airport in Tokyo in November 19, 2018. And if you look for culprits, the fingerprints of the French and Japanese authorities are everywhere on the crime scene. This is again, strangely enough, like the conspiracy, a dimension of the story that has been completely ignored by most of the media. The latest documentary, I think it's the fourth or sixth one, that has been broadcast recently by the Apple Plus platform called Wanted, the search for Carlos Ghosn, ignore completely the responsibility of the French government in triggering the crisis. Of course, the blame on the arrest, the treatment of Carlos Ghosn, absolutely unfit of a democratic system and of a proper judiciary, is entirely the responsibility of the Japanese. But you cannot forget that the trigger of the crisis came from France, came from Paris, came actually from the President of the Republic himself, Emmanuel Macron, when he was the finance minister. Since the publication of the book that you can see here in 3 different editions in 2020, a lot of new evidence have come forward about the reality of the conspiracy, and most of them have been also ignored by the mainstream media, and in most of the book, of course, except this one. Now, going back to globalization on a broader perspective, globalization has always been confronted with local peculiarities, with idiosyncrasies, or like Pascal Lamy, that was here in July in this cycle, used to call national preferences. Actually, when Pascal was the trade commissioner, he asked anthropologists to look into those national preferences. And in the particular case of France and Japan, and this is a common ground for the two countries, there is a sort of, it's a difficult word for me to pronounce, egalitarianism. This idea that we are all equal and should remain equal. In the case of Japan, is this funny idea that 90% of the Japanese population belongs to the middle class. It wasn't true in the 80s when Bill and I were in Japan. And it's even less true today when as an effect of the globalization. And I must say a lot of financial management by the central banks, inequality have grown exponentially in Japan. And as for France, as we know, liberté, égalité, fraternité, well, I can tell you, because qui aime bien châtie bien, that there is not so much liberty, little equality, and as of fraternity, frankly, it's a bad joke. But again, those national preferences, there is globalization. And in the case of top managers, there was, and there still is maybe, a market for a very limited number of people. And if Carlos Ghosn made a mistake, it was not to play that game more ruthlessly. He recognized himself today that he should have left the alliance in 2009 in the middle of the financial crisis, something he would not do for moral reasons. He would not leave those two companies in the middle of a huge financial crisis. He was offered the job to run General Motors. He would have moved to a country where becoming rich is not an issue. He would have been paid twice what he was paid at Renault and Nissan, and he would not certainly have not spent 152 days in a jail in Kosuge in Tokyo. So I will just finish by addressing the main theme of the Count of Monte Cristo, that is vindication and revenge. Because for those who have read the novel, it's 1,400 pages, by the way. A large part of it, of course, is dedicated to when Edmond Dantes is free, rich, he comes back to France to take revenge of the people who put him in jail for 2 decades. And it's a fascinating part of the book. I don't think Carlos needs vindication because his legacy as an executive in the car industry is firmly installed. And you only have to look at the main short-term beneficiaries of the demise of the alliance. One is Stellantis, run by a Portuguese, Carlos Tavares. And Carlos Tavares is without doubt the star alumni of what I call the Carlos Ghosn School of Management. Stellantis managed to merge with Fiat Chrysler, and I will recall in the book when Carlos was arrested in November 2018, he had an appointment in January 2019 in Paris with John Elkann, the heir of the Agnelli family and the chairman of Fiat Chrysler. Well, good for Carlos Tavares. He managed to make that merger. Another case I really like is the case of José Muñoz. Here you talk about globalization. After a Portuguese, a Spaniard. José was born in Madrid, educated in Madrid, and was one of the members of the executive committee of Nissan when he was basically rooted out, expelled, chased by the Japanese nomenclatura for refusing to join the campaign and the conspiracy against Carlos Ghosn. Everything is told in the book. Carlos is now the global COO, Chief Operating Officer of Hyundai, in charge globally of most of the day-to-day operation, but especially of the American car market, the North America market. And this is, I remind you, the most important one. Smaller than China, but much more profitable. And José, I must say, is in a mission of revenge. And if you look at the figures, and if you are at the Nissan headquarters in Yokohama, you should be very worried of what's happening in the US market. The third example is Ashwani Gupta, an Indian that Carlos Ghosn selected to run Mitsubishi when Nissan took control of Mitsubishi. Until recently, Ashwani Gupta was the COO of Nissan. He was ejected in another palace coup in the spring. So, to conclude, as for the revenge on the companies, I'm afraid, given the current revolution going on in the car industry, a revolution that is unprecedented in a history of more than 100 years. It's the global market that will take care of Renault and Nissan. How long those companies will remain independent, I have my doubts. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. These conferences were very interesting. Now we are going to open the floor to several interventions. Portanto, estou à vossa disposição para qualquer questão que queiram colocar os conferencistas, de maneira que Quem quiser agora fazer uso da palavra, agradecia que se pronunciasse.
Well, thank you very much for your intervention. Congratulations on the organization and the wonderful presentation you both had today. My question is about the auto sector on the world. Probably in the 20th century was the sector, the group that growth the most, from the beginning of the century until the end of the century, and also the sector where we saw most failures and defaults. So you see wonderful names disappeared, and that was not related with the quality. My question is, in this century, in the beginning of the century, the sector have changed a lot, and you see one company, their value is $850 billion, which is, almost or more than a third of the oil market cap in the world. And you see the second biggest company, I think, is Toyota with 250 billion. And then you see a Chinese with 100 billion and so forth, Porsche, Mercedes, and even Ferrari, but in a lower position. What do you think will be the trend in this century? Having 2 or 3 big around the world global players, or you see more a crowd of bigger names divided by 12, 20 big names?
So I suppose that's for me to answer. Well, it's very complicated to answer that question in a short period of time. What we are going through now, as I said, is the biggest revolution in the history of the car, because we are moving to electricity. It's an absolute radical shift. And of course, there's been big shifts in the history of the industry previously. For instance, talking about the North American market, when the Japanese came in, and the big three started to lose ground, and the factories started to shift from the Great Lake region to the south, and that was a massive shift. And there has been losers and winners, but this is much more dramatic. But the car company you are referring to, Tesla, it's a growing company, but their value does not reflect the car industry. It reflects the tech industry. And I think Elon Musk himself, not sure he regards Tesla as a car company. They do manufacture cars, but on that particular aspect, it's not their strong point, and the competition is coming. What we are absolutely convinced of is that there is a lot of new players. You look at China, there is 30, 40 completely new companies. I mean, one of them, Highways, is now selling cars, I think, in Portugal. I saw one in the street in Lisbon yesterday. Well, actually, they are selling something like 9,000 cars a year. So there might be one in Portugal. I mean, those companies will not survive, obviously. I would say for the incumbents, the companies that have been dominating that industry for decades, like General Motors, but it's now a second-rate player, but let's say Toyota, Volkswagen, Daimler-Benz, it's a huge challenge. I do think they have the resources to make it, but it's going to be painful, extremely costly. Now, the big issue, of course, is that what should be the public policies in that particular situation? And it's a very, very tricky one. I'm personally liberal. I'm all in favor of free markets, of free competition. But to have free competition, you need to have a sort of level playing field. One thing we can come back to discuss is what happened with China after China entered the WTO in 2001. There were specific conditions. Bill mentioned that it entered with a different status, not a market, how do you call that, market economy. But if you take the example, but the competition was absolutely fierce. Some industries, I'm thinking of Portugal in particular, in the footwear and textile, they had to confront the Chinese competition head-on. It was extremely painful. They lost half, they're in good shape today, much better shape, but they lost half of their workforce. The companies are completely different. Their products are different. And the car industry is going to be through that type of period. To predict who are going the winners and the losers, frankly, I can't. I don't think Carlos Ghosn could. He touched about the issue at the end of the book. We are in the very early stage of a massive revolution. And there will be, one thing is absolutely clear, there would be some winners and a lot of losers. Managing the public opinion will be extremely complex because you will hurt a lot of vested interest, and managing the right public policies will be a huge challenge because a lot of things can go badly, badly, badly wrong. I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but that's the best I can do at this stage.
Thank you to you both. I have two for Philippe. One is, you vaguely mentioned, and I'm an M&A lawyer and finance lawyer, a cultural clash. You mentioned many things. Mm-hmm. You mentioned nationalism. You mentioned, how idiosyncrasies of Japanese and French. But in the merger, how did the cultural clash happen? Because I always got the feeling, I haven't read your book, so I'm going to do it. Mm. But most of M&A transactions, they fail for cultural reasons. And that's the first question. I would like to know your views on that. The second one is, Carlos Tavares just announced yesterday on that Atlantis is ready to move from the conventional fuel to synthetic and change, and the cars will be changed almost at no cost. And this is really something that might change the rule of the game, because we've been very much looking at other sources and other alternatives. I'd like to see also to have your views. For Bill, I understood exactly what you said. There is one thing that I would like you to expand, is on the European role. If you believe on the European role in this new scenario, where do you see the UK Brexiter in this European player, so that we understand, because you have obviously a very, very interesting point of observation. You are now living in Ireland, so coming from UK, so you have obviously a different perspective from us. Thank you.
Very interesting questions. I will start by Bill, and then afterwards I will go to Philippe.
Okay, fine. Get more time to think.
Well, thank you, Pedro, for asking me about a tragedy. The British decision in 2016 to shoot itself in the foot in this self-harming way of leaving the European Union. But anyway, talking about the future, which is your question, what will the UK's contribution be to be part of the European evolution? I think that the UK, I always thought when Britain voted to leave that we would spend a certain amount of time putting up the sails on our ship and sailing it away from Europe. And then after quite a short time, we would turn the ship round and we would sail it back. And I think that is what's going to happen, not to rejoin, because the politics are too problematic, but the UK I think UK business and UK politics, which will dominate after a general election next year, understand that the European market, the European industrial, in both services and goods, system is where Britain belongs. So every effort will be made to become closer again to Europe, to the European market, and to reconcile the two systems. We have already seen that the UK has been absolutely strategically connected to Europe in the war in Ukraine. So in defense and security, in a way, we are in the middle of a proof of that Britain has to understand its destiny is going to be determined on the continent of Europe, which is what Winston Churchill taught us over many decades. In his great speech in Zurich in 1947, he said, we need a common European system, and the UK, in his case then, will be part of these interlocking circles. And I think that is the way the UK will be. It will have to find its way back towards being part of a Europe which will keep changing, because Europe will have 30 countries within the next decade. It will expand, it will have to find new ways to do things, and it will respond to these challenges. But the UK has a European destiny, just not as part of, formally, the European Union.
Well, thank you very much. Philippe?
Okay, first of all, I have to make very clear that it never was about a merger. The reason why it was called an alliance. The two companies were to remain separated. And the process of integration, for instance, in the key field of technology research, will be a very, very progressive one. It never was easy, but it was going into the right direction. But of course, for all sorts of reasons, the capitalistic structure of the alliance had to be addressed. For instance, to take in Fiat and Chrysler, or when they came very close, or they had very advanced discussion in 2006 to take in General Motors. But it never was about a merger. That was the wrong impression the French government gave the Japanese, and they got cold feet about that perspective, especially since the French government was a shareholder of Renault, and the idea for the Japanese to become part of a group where the French government would have a say on the strategy and the life of the Japanese company, something that is not happening in Japan, well, not in that way, it does happen, but in a completely different way, was of course something extremely difficult to swallow. But was it inevitable? The question is, was the failure inevitable? Was in fact Carlos Ghosn such a dominant figure in the alliance that with his retirement, one way or the other, it was done in an absolutely unacceptable way, but it would have happened anyway, because he was 64, he was going to leave anyway one day. Maybe the alliance would not survive, but for almost 20 years, it was managed in a completely different way, and it works beautifully. And this is not the end, and again, this sort of nationalistic retraction by the Nissan nomenclature is not seen in other Japanese companies. I mean, until very recently, the number 2 at Toyota was Didier Leroy, also another alumni of the Carlos Ghosn School of Management coming from Renault. And Toyota continues to take in international executive, foreign executive. The Koreans are much, much better at it for all sorts of historical reasons. So I'll stop here because it would take me hours, and it's partly explained in the book. So I would refer you to the book in either of the 3 editions.
Well, thank you very much. We still have time for 2 more questions. 2 more questions. So, and afterwards we'll have to end. We'll have only to say some few words and we have to end. So, you first.
Thanks a lot for the invitation for this great event of the Conferências do Casino and for the Sociedade Nacional de Geografia. Just to present myself, I'm Joaquim Paiva Chaves. I'm a regular reader from The Economist for at least the last 50 years. And the question is very simple, and the question to Bill is inflation and globalization are part of the same political equation. And where in the near future can we find the equilibrium of both of them? If we want less inflation, we need more globalization. If we don't want globalization, we'll pay for more inflation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bill, it's your turn.
Okay, it's a very interesting question. I mean, it's clear that over some decades, China's entry and the entry of other highly populated countries increased the supply of labor in producing goods, which did help to restrain prices. But a second factor was peace, was the lack of wars that on a major basis which would disrupt supplies in major ways. And of course, third absence was a pandemic of a virus which also disrupted supplies. I think that the current inflation is a result of a combination of some of those disruptions to supply caused by war, caused by the virus, caused by politics, but also the central bank's response to those crises, which hugely expanded the supply of money. So to me, I don't blame the current inflation on the slowing of globalization. I blame it more on monetary policy, on central banks that overcompensated, overreacted to the genuine crises that existed in particularly the pandemic, but then also last year with the war in Ukraine. The central banker's motto used to be that the job of the central banker is to take away the alcohol before the party has got going properly. Take away the punch bowl, as the Americans call it, but anyway, the alcohol before the party has really got going. And what the central bankers did was to wait until the party had got quite wild before they started to take away the alcohol. I'm afraid we're left with a hangover as a result. And so I think that the biggest factor has been the central bank's misjudgment of those crises. I forgive them to some extent because it was a difficult judgment to make, but nevertheless, our job is not to forgive central bankers, our job is to criticize them, and therefore they do deserve some criticism. I think they were too slow in Europe and North America in particular. So I believe globalization will continue. It still will help to reduce prices, as in the car industry that we're seeing. It will come in new technology, in batteries and so forth, and in energy. As long as the central bankers don't mess up, we can get out of inflation again.
I'm a project and policy officer in an environmental NGO, and I would like to ask Bill, you argue that the energy crisis in Europe was partly solved by globalization, but don't you also think that globalization can be blamed for climate crisis because of increased trade, increased transportation? What are your views about it? Thanks.
So, Bill, do you want to say
Yes.
something about it?
No. So I suppose I have an orthodox view that I believe that economic development, which means human development, can be made compatible with the environment. When I went to Japan in the 1980s, people would often talk about the fog in London. And of course, the fog in London was a result of pollution 40 years before, which was eliminated in the 1950s. It was a consequence of economic development. And then intervention by government to deal with the external effects of that solved it. So I believe that, if globalization means increased prosperity around the world, I don't wish to criticize it. I think that it needs to be made compatible with the environment by intervention, just in the same way as we have made our cities cleaner as we've got richer. So we should, as a world, be able to make the world cleaner, as fortunately poor people in other countries get richer as well. So I think it would be a terrible tragedy to stop economic development around the world on the basis of climate change. It needs to be adapted and reformed in order to make it compatible with the survival of the planet, in my view. And it can be done, in my view.
Well, exceptionally, we still have time for a very short question. So, can you ask the question, if you please?
Mine is very short, and I just wanted to ask Bill Emmett what the topic of his next book is going to be and when it's going to come out. I remember Good Italy, Bad Italy, which was a blockbuster. Is there something in the pipeline to look forward to?
Well, that's a very kind question. I do recommend Broken Alliances, by the way. It's a blockbuster. You should buy this book. But nevertheless, I'm going to answer your question. I'm working on a book about preventing conflict in Asia. Why? Partly because of the think tank I chair, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Defense and Security think tank, and Asia, particularly through a huge event they do every year in Singapore. This is the central issue. But also our Japanese background that Philippe and I share. Suddenly, we are in a way shocked by the fact that Japan has decided to rebuild its army, its military, increasing its defense spending by 60% over the next 5 years. Why? Because it sees an increased risk of war in Asia, and it wishes to deter war. I'm trying to do a book about how to make these strategies more successful, more likely to succeed in preventing war. When will it be published? I hope it will be published in June next year, but that depends on whether the author does his job quickly enough. And that is a matter for speculation as to whether I do the job quickly enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very briefly, if I may add, I think in the short term, the best way to prevent war in Asia is to win the war in Ukraine. This is our war that the Ukrainians are fighting on our behalf. Now, I just want to tell you to to stay tuned, as they say in the radio, on the Carlos Ghosn saga. It's far from over. Yesterday was the first hearing in Lebanon of the $1 billion criminal suit that Carlos is launching against Nissan and 12 individuals. For your information, Pedro, they did not show up. They were not even represented. But the proceeding is going on, and it will have quite a big impact. And because I forgot to say it at the end of my presentation, it doesn't look for vindication, but it does deserve a judgment, a proper judgment, in a court. But that court cannot be a Moscow show trial made in Japan. That's it.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for both conferences. And I would like very much indeed your presence. We are going to have afterwards cocktails, so you can be with us, join us at cocktails. It would be a great pleasure for us. And I just would like to say some few words saying, well, if I have, or I had friends, British friends, nationalists against European Union, I would make my best to try to understand my friends. It would be very hard for me to understand him, but I would do my best. If I had, well, a German nationalist, radical nationalist against the European Union, I would try my best to understand him. Being against globalization, the European Union, etc. If I had a friend, but it would be hard for me to understand him. If I had a French against globalization and against the European Union, I would try my best to understand him. I must confess, it would be very, very, very difficult for me to understand the Portuguese being a nationalist radical and against the European Union. I think he should go to the doctor, to be honest. Without trying to be too much provocative, but because I don't see, or a Luxembourgeois being a nationalist radical and against the European Union. And sometime we'll have someone from Andorra being nationalist and against globalization. It's a little hard for me to understand that. But it has been a great pleasure to be with you here. And once again, I want to thank Bill Ammott and Philippe Ries for being here with us, and thank you for being also with us, and until next opportunity.